You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 353 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show again is Will Porter. He's a staff writer over at RT. He's, of course, been on, I think, 46 episodes of the show before today, and is a good friend of mine and a great foreign policy analyst, and just does great work reading and reporting the news all day. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be back on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, luckily I've been able to have you on almost once a week for the past couple months, and basically what we've been doing is just picking out some of the most interesting things that you've written about at RT during that time and discussing them in more detail. So the first thing we have today is a story that I think you worked on part of, but is extremely important. And that is Julian Assange was indicted on 17 counts in a superseding indictment, including part of it being charges of the Espionage Act. So, Will, I'm going to go ahead and let you break down for the audience what we know up till this point. And remember, folks, we're recording this a few hours after it happened, so he's only going to be able to give, probably pretty preliminary analysis here.
Yeah. So, as you said, it is a breaking story still, so there's a lot of details we're still waiting for. However, the basic story has been told that, Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, has now been indicted on 17 additional counts. And I believe that each count is good for 10 years, and so we're looking at potentially a 170-year prison sentence for Julian Assange, under, as you said, partially under the Espionage Act. Now, I think this is something a lot of, people who've been watching the WikiLeaks situation, the Assange situation, we've sort of expected this, that, a month or so ago, the Washington or the Department of Justice came out with an indictment about a computer crime, a single sole charge, and we've kind of been expecting the other shoe to drop, and I think that's kind of what this is. It's these 17 indictments. Now, Assange's, I think his whole extradition procedure, like that still has to be sorted out in the UK because the Swedes also, Assange is still wanted under this, what I would call sort of a flimsy rape accusation, which he's not actually accused of raping anybody. It's some kind of sexual assault crime that gets mistranslated into rape from Sweden. But nonetheless, Assange is still facing extradition also to Sweden. And so it's not entirely clear what's going to happen with his legal status, but yes, he has been indicted under these 17 additional charges.
Well, on the rape thing real quick, I think something that I've misstated a little bit on the show is I don't think he's charged with anything in Sweden. They want him more for questioning. And, that's even more kind of scratch your head. Why can't they just go to the UK and talk to him there since they obviously know where to find him now and have for the past 7 years. But even being in UK custody, you would think that if what they really need to do is just talk to him about something they allege is pretty serious, which is, kind of the sexual assault of a woman. And I think another case of the woman saying that, he made her feel really uncomfortable about things, but didn't force her to do anything. It's really interesting that they just don't go talk to him and are looking to extradite him to Sweden.
Right. And let's also note here that Assange has said he's expressed his willingness to talk to Swedish authorities or investigators. His whole thing was that he wants guarantees that he's not going to be extradited to the U.S. for his political crimes of reporting, certain facts. And so that's been Assange's thing the whole time. However, you actually sent me something when you sort of commented on this that, they're saying that Assange is in British prisons and they can't get a hold of him. It's like they're saying, like, as if he's on the moon or something. Like, why can't you contact him? Why can't anybody get in touch with him? But I don't know what all the legal procedures are for getting in touch with people inside British jails. So, I'm not sure.
Yeah, everything seems like excuse making at the point that, this crime, I think some of them allegedly occurred in 2010. And I was recently, reading some stuff on the actual start of this, and Assange was in Sweden, and I believe either talked to prosecutors or prosecutors told him it was okay to leave the country, and then they looked to extradite him after he left. And so, it's quite the crazy thing you have going on here. I think one of the important things that we always talk about when it comes to Julian Assange and the trial against him, Will, is that this is much bigger than Julian Assange. And as important as Assange and WikiLeaks are, and all the truth that they have brought us that, I've covered with you and Scott Horton on the show recently, there's just so much more importance on like First Amendment and journalism. So I'll let you talk about that, Will, because you're the journalist here.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, like this sort of echoes the comments or the reaction of Edward Snowden, the whistleblower who, the NSA whistleblower, or he was a contractor at Booz Allen Hamilton, but he leaked NSA documents. And Snowden said that this is about way more than simply Julian Assange, the single man. This is about journalism in the United States. This is about the First Amendment. And this could potentially be the death knell of the First Amendment. If journalists aren't allowed to do this sort of important reporting on their government, on the actions of world governments or world powers, then I'm not sure what journalism we would be allowed to do. Like, if you're not allowed to do that important work, then it seems like journalism has really been gutted and been turned into sort of like, I don't know, entertainment or something. But it doesn't. The fourth estate function of journalism to challenge power is sort of being gutted. And we totally see that in these types of indictments against, Assange and other whistleblowers and stuff.
Right. Well, I don't have much more to add there. Will, do you have anything else you want to add on Assange?
No, I think that's I'd encourage your listeners to just watch for details because that is a breaking story still.
Another story that's been developing through this week, and I think you've been keeping an eye on it and covering some at RT, is allegations of Syrian chemical weapons use. Now, this is something that me and Will, I think, have taken special interest in and have really taken the time to understand all the small details and facts, whether it's Duma, Count Sheikhoun, or East Ghouta, and have several episodes in the past of the show breaking those down. But generally, Will, I want to talk about on today's show why it's important that the U.S. seems to be indicating that, hey, maybe Syria is either going to or is carrying out chemical weapons against the rebels in Idlib.
Yeah, sure. So it does always kind of seem like the timing of these allegations sort of coincides with important developments in the war and things that are happening on the ground in Syria. And so with Duma, you had the prior chemical weapons allegations during a big offensive on a town near Damascus, near the capital, from where they'd been shelling the capital city. The rebels had been. And so just as the government went to retake that area, that territory, you had all these allegations of chemical weapons and the use of chemical weapons. And oftentimes these allegations originate with Syrian opposition activists or, rebel fighters. And we know that among the rebel fighters are, jihadist groups and Al-Qaeda and, the Army of Islam and all these different factions. But these most recent chemical weapons allegations, I think, is sort of tied to the final effort, the final push by the Syrian government and its allies in Russia and Iran and other militia allies in taking back the Idlib province. Because the Idlib province has been sort of like the final rebel stronghold where the Syrian government kind of tried to like corral all the remaining rebel fighters. And now there's been I'm not exactly sure who launched the offensive first, but there was a rebel offensive on the Russian Kamamim base. And I know that sort of the Syrian government used that as a reason to respond. And that amid all this sort of conflict and all of this, this final push in Idlib, that is sort of when, in that context, these new allegations have emerged. And unlike previous allegations where the U.S. really like latched onto them very quickly and just immediately expressed certainty about them, in this case, it seems like the State Department has sort of been a little more cautious about this one. They've said that like we'll continue to investigate, and there've been no definitive conclusions, but we have seen some evidence. They said that chemical weapons were used on rebel fighters. They didn't cite any of their evidence. They didn't say what they actually have to support this idea, but they are saying that we've seen some kind of preliminary indication that this is the case.
Yeah, and there's a lot of factors going on here. I mean, some of these rebels are backed by Turkey. Some are backed by other Gulf Arab states. There's a lot of foreign fighters. I think mainly Chinese Uyghurs who are, have formed jihadist factions and gone to fight in Syria. And then there's just kind of Arab Al-Qaeda guys who have coalesced in Syria and are fighting under the al-Nusra banner. There was a kind of a ceasefire negotiated with Turkey that was supposed to lead to, I think, mostly the eventual surrender and kind of the reabsorption of the Syrian government, most of the rebel territory, maybe a buffer zone on the Syrian border. I've heard like 20 miles range, but Turkey hasn't been able to hold up their end of that agreement. I think it's been pretty clear that even if like the Syrian side is, carrying out some bombing of the rebel positions, there's been an awful lot of attacks by the jihadist factions there as well, including, like you said, recently on the Russian base, There was one on a Palestinian refugee camp. There's been a lot on just different Syrian army positions. And so it seems like maybe Russia and Syria have had enough. It's been, I would say about 8 months. What was it, October or November of 2018 that those negotiations were going on between Syria and or mostly, I guess, Russia, Turkey, and Iran were probably the main parties in those talks. So there's still a lot left to be resolved in Syria here, Will, and I guess, the State Department would see any kind of leverage against the Syrian state, and they would think that allegations of chemical weapons use would be leverage they could use against the Syrian state, either to carry out airstrikes and maybe hope to gain more support or autonomy for their Kurdish friends, or to just, kind of keep Assad tied up in Idlib, thinking that's going to buy the Syrian Kurds more time to do whatever they're trying to do to, achieve whatever kind of ends they're trying to achieve. I think that's one of the problems here. I don't think I understand, nor do I think the American government understands what the actual objectives of the Syrian Kurds are.
Yeah, I fully agree.
I guess I didn't leave you much to comment on our question there. Not the best of my hosting duties, but I guess we can move on, Will, with just maybe a final word being is that the reason this is important is in the past, these chemical weapons allegations have been met, at least under the Trump administration, with limited airstrikes against Assad's positions. We also know that, the U.S. has said that anything that Iran does in the Middle East could result in a limited strike. So, maybe this ends up being blamed on Iran as well as Assad or something crazy like that. And this just isn't all about Syria. But certainly it seems to me to be something dangerous going on. And I guess that's the reason we could move over to the Iran topic now, Will, which I know that you've been covering in the past week. Looking at Iraq first, what are the Iraqis saying here?
Yeah, sure. So just before I get into that, maybe I give a little bit of context that'll kind of bring us up to Iraq. And so, we've covered a lot of the Iran thing on the show. I don't have to rehash all of the, events that have happened, but suffice to say, there's been a lot of hostility and hawkishness between Iran and the Trump administration, mostly coming from the Trump administration. It's mostly been a one-sided thing. However, most recently, there's been this whole thing that Washington has been making a big stink about some alleged Iranian threat in the Middle East to U.S. allies or interests. The threat that they alleged was pretty vague. They didn't really give much detail on it, but eventually they started suggesting that Iran was going to use one of its proxy forces to attack Americans overseas somewhere. And soon that became claims that it was going to happen in Iraq, that Iran was going to use one of the militias that it backs in Iraq to attack U.S. troops still stationed there, or like the U.S. embassy or something. And so this became like a talking point. And in fact, the State Department, even like earlier this week, they evacuated all of their non-essential personnel from Iraq. And so kind of keeping in tune with this whole thing, they've kind of made a big show out of that. Now, actually, it was kind of embarrassing for them during, when they're trying to say there's this threat in Iraq. This British major general named Chris Geeka actually came out and said that, like, I don't see any kind of increased threat or any kind of ramped up threat from Iran or its militias. So that was kind of funny that he kind of undercut them there. But the U.S. very quickly like rebutted him and rebuked him, and he may have even backtracked on what he said, but I don't remember. So anyway, in all this context of all, of the U.S. officials or the non-essential personnel leaving and all this talk of a threat, you actually did have a rocket attack on what's called the Green Zone. And this is like a heavily fortified area in Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, which contains the U.S. embassy and other diplomatic offices. And somebody shot a Katyusha rocket and didn't hit anything inside the Green Zone. And actually, this is kind of similar to something that happened last year, too, that someone fired a mortar into the Green Zone and missed the embassy by a mile, but yet it was still reported as an attack on the U.S. embassy. And it sort of seems like that's kind of what's happened here, is that this Katyusha rocket didn't hit anything, but it was being reported as an attack on the embassy. And in response to this, it kind of had everyone freaking out. It had people in Iraq thinking, oh, this is about to be used as an escalation or as a reason or as a pretext to escalate with Iran, that the U.S. is going to sort of, use this. And so in response to this, you had a lot of high-ranking Iraqi officials and leaders and influential people, coming out against this alleged Iranian attack. And so we can kind of get into some of those responses now, if you'd like.
Go for it.
Sure. So first you had a guy named Muqtada al-Sadr, who's sort of like been a very influential figure in Iraq. He used to run something called the Mahdi Army, which is an armed Shia sect in Iraq that's been disbanded now. And during the Iraq War, actually, the U.S. treated Sadr as like this big enemy, even though Sadr all along was neither like Sadr was neither backed by, the Sunni al-Qaeda jihadi type factions, nor was he a super pro-Iranian faction. So it was kind of weird the U.S. made a big enemy out of Sadr, even though he was sort of like the most independent out of anyone there. Nonetheless, though, Sadr came out pretty harshly against this war, or against the prospect of a war with Iran. And he said that it would literally spell the end of Iraq. He said that if there was any kind of conflict that broke out between Iran and the U.S., that it would bleed over back into Iraq and completely destroy the country. And Sadr now is some kind of big politician in Iraq. He's very influential. His coalition in the last election actually took like a bunch of seats in the parliament, and he has a lot of influence. But other like more pro-Iranian people in Iraq also, like leaders and figureheads, also came out against this. You had the very pro-Iranian former head of the Badr Brigade, which is another Iranian-backed militia, Shia militia, who is now an Iraqi MP named Haider al-Amiri, who came out and basically said that any kind of war, he echoed Sadr's statement and said it would burn everyone in the country. You've got a guy named Qais al-Khazili, who runs a group called Asab al-Haq, as well as a group called Khatib Hezbollah, who are both kind of similarly like very gung-ho about the Shia pro-Iranian factions, who also came out against any kind of war here. So I just think that's interesting. You have all these very influential figures in Iraq completely slamming any idea of a war with Iran. And I guess the last thing I'll say here too is that when I'm talking about like whether somebody is Iran-backed or it's an Iran-backed faction, I don't mean this in the sense that people say it about the Houthis. Like in Iraq, Iran openly backs a lot of political parties and militias and stuff. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, and of course, again, all this is so important when you look at what's happening right now and see that there's so many hawks in the United States, Bolton and Pompeo, who are really looking for, it seems, any excuse now to continue to ramp up hostilities with Iran. Now, we've kind of looked at Syria and Iraq where there's a potential false flag. And I think in Iraq there is, legitimate threat that the Iranians could use like their bat forces to wage some kind of proxy war against the United States should we, try to attack Iran or something like that. But, looking at Iran itself, there's now these statements from the Iranian government that they're going to increase the rate of uranium enrichment. And you covered this, and this is being, I think, misreported as, oh my God, the Iranians are trying to make a nuke.
Yeah, sure. And I guess one last thing I'll say too about Iraq. I think I kind of didn't summarize my point here. My point being is that the U.S. claims Iran and all these, pro-Iranian militias are going to attack the U.S. But meanwhile, they're all completely denouncing any potential war. Like they're all pretty dovish, it seems, on that question. So anyway, now to Iranian uranium enrichment. So during all this stuff that's happening in Iraq, all this alleged, this missile attack and these alleged Iranian threats, there's also been developments on the sanctions front. And so the Trump administration actually recently moved to block Iran from shipping out its excess heavy water, which is that's used in certain types of nuclear reactors, the type that Iran uses. And they've also blocked Iran from shipping out its excess stockpile of low enriched uranium. And so under the nuclear deal, which Iran is still trying to abide by to some extent, trying to keep within it. But under the deal, Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium is supposed to never exceed 300 kilograms. They have a cap on their stockpile. But now, because the Trump administration has sort of moved to block these shipments, I think they were sending them to Russia before. And because now the Trump administration has blocked these shipments, Iran is sort of forced to pass that 300 kilogram cap. And so this week, an Iranian official came right out and said that they were going to disregard that cap on their enrichment. And actually, they went a little bit further than that, too, and said that actually they would also kick up their rate of enrichment by a multiple of 4. So, they're going to start enriching a lot more uranium in addition to just, disregarding the cap. And I was recently reading the text of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. And the deal actually does have certain stuff in there that says things like if other parties aren't fulfilling their end of the deal, that Iran will take measures to sort of limit their own compliance with the deal. And so as far as Iran is concerned, all of this is perfectly within, it's perfectly valid under the nuclear deal. Now, I'm not totally sure if those lines in the deal were just unilateral statements from Iran that they had them put in there, or if the deal itself endorses this idea that Iran should limit their compliance. But either way, I don't think that's an entirely unreasonable thing to suggest that if other parties of the deal aren't living up to their end of it, then, why should Iran why should they be expected to fully live up to all their commitments? So that's sort of where they're coming from.
Right, because, the situation we have here is Iran is actually trying to export the low enriched uranium. They just can't because of the way the U.S. is blocking it from happening. And so then Iran's like, okay, well, we're going to increase the rate of enrichment. So either we're going to end up with a whole bunch of nuclear fuel because you won't let us have it leave the country, or you're going to have to end that blockade. And that way we could send out this nuclear fuel. And I think that's actually, probably a pretty good income boon for Iran as well.
Yeah.
From my understanding, there's now a whole lot of countries that produce what Iran does. And I think they have pretty large uranium stores. So this is just an important step, I think, for Iran to take. I don't think it's all that provocative or anything like that. And remember, we're talking about enriching uranium, I believe, to 3.6%, when, medical grade is 20 and nuclear grade is, I think, 95. So you're not even close to doing anything that would violate the nuclear agreement.
Yeah, but however, I will say, though, that during the same announcement, they actually said that in addition to kicking up the rate of enrichment, they said that if this isn't resolved within 60 days, this whole sanction thing and blocking their shipments of low enriched uranium, they said they would begin enriching uranium to a higher grade of purity. And so, as you said, Iran right now is temporarily, at least, limited to enriching only to 3.67% or something, which you can use, to fuel nuclear reactors and maybe for some medical isotope stuff. I'm not totally sure what the purity is for that. But yeah, like you said, you need over 90% to get weapons grade uranium. And but Iran has now threatened that if this isn't resolved within 60 days, that they're going to go back up to, I think they suggested they go back up to 20%. And anything over 20% is considered highly enriched uranium. And I don't believe that Iran ever was known to have the capability to enrich beyond 20% on any kind of large scale. But that is sort of what they're threatening to do now, is that if this isn't resolved, that they will start, ramping up their enrichment. However, this has sort of forced them into a dilemma. So, if Iran is perceived to be violating the deal, even though, as you and I have said, that this seems pretty reasonable what they're saying here, but if they're perceived to at least be violating the deal, they actually risk losing some of their friends in the EU, I think, who've sort of up until this point have made some kind of half-hearted effort to try to keep Iran in from the cold. But even France already, I think, has made some threats about Iran. If they don't keep up their end of the deal, that France is going to do something to punish them. Even though meanwhile Washington completely abrogates its end of the deal, it entirely walks out of the deal. But yeah, France is now demanding that Iran keeps its end. But it has sort of put them in this position where, if they're even perceived of violating the deal, that might lose them some of their friends and some of their defenders and supporters in the EU. And so I think this is sort of they're walking a fine line here. They're trying to maintain their autonomy and their independence and stuff, but also they are reliant on some other world powers here. So it's sort of putting them in a precarious place.
Well, I think a couple things you had to look at here is that I believe within the non-proliferation treaty, you're allowed to enrich uranium either up to 18 or 20%, and that's whatever the medical grade is. Yeah. And so I think that's what Iran has threatened to do within 60 days if, the economic stranglehold of the country isn't relieved. I think that there's really nothing provocative about this move, Will. When you look at the fact that for Iran, this was supposed to be an exchange of, we give up our capabilities to develop a nuclear bomb, and in exchange, you open us up to the economies of the world. And the fact is that the U.S. sanctions against Iran have prevented that from happening. And even though the European allies have, I think, kind of said that we don't support the U.S. sanctions and all this, European companies know that they can't be secondarily sanctioned by the U.S. or it'll absolutely ruin them. And so you have a situation where, unless the European, I guess, companies or countries are willing to stand up and say that, we're going to somehow figure out a way to facilitate this where our companies can't be punished by the United States, then, that's not enough. And that's why Iran's looking for. And then it seems absolutely reasonable to me that if they're not getting the benefits they were supposed to get from, joining this nuclear deal, then they enrich uranium up to what's allowed under the non-proliferation treaty, which is the treaty that everyone else is in. I mean, really, the nuke deal is just a safeguarded weapons program for Iran because, U.S. neocons made up a whole bunch of threats about their nuclear program. And, I guess just the last thing I'll add here is Iran also gave up a lot of centrifuges and poured concrete into the Iraq reactor. So it's not like, even if, we just go back to Iran being in the NPT treaty, they already didn't lose.
Right. And I think this too is sort of common to the Iranian negotiation strategy. Before the JCPOA was fully inked out, Iran, part of their thing was to build more centrifuges than they would even need. And so partially to give some away as bargaining chips. And so that might be sort of what they're doing here, saying that we're going to start enriching way more uranium. So if you don't want us to do that, then maybe, come to the table. So they're trying to, do whatever they can to, I don't know, have some position here.
I guess the next threat to look at of possibly being a news story that Bolton or the neocons could use to provoke some kind of strike or more larger conflict against Iran is something going on in Yemen between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. And Will, I think me and you have both noticed quite the increase in Houthi attacks on Saudi Arabia in the past week or two, especially from drones and missiles.
Yeah. So I found this to be interesting as well. And I think, it's been about the last 2 weeks that we've seen this spate of at least attacks that the Houthis are taking credit for. I mean, I don't claim to know specific details about these attacks or who carried them out. But they've been blamed on the Houthis, and then the Houthis have mostly taken credit for them. So you had, I think, 2 Saudi oil pumping stations that the Houthis attacked with an explosive armed drone. And I believe the Houthis have started to kind of build their own homegrown, kind of ragtag drone program. It seems like that's sort of off the ground now, and they're using them. But you had also these sabotage attacks on these ships in the UAE at the port of I think it was called Fujairah. We don't know for a fact that we have no idea actually who carried out these attacks. Somebody blamed them on Iran. I've heard reports that explosive waterborne drones were used on these ships to sabotage them. It's not totally clear who's behind them. However, the only other group that seems to be taking credit for similar attacks like this in that region are the Houthis. And earlier this week, there have been, I think even today or yesterday, there was an attack on an airport in Saudi. Or there may have even been 2 attacks on airports in Saudi in this last week. And so, the Houthis have definitely been stepping up their drone game. And now I haven't seen as much as I would have expected more blame to be put on Iran after these things. I think some sort of token statements have been given that the Iran-backed Houthis did this. But given all the other tensions and stuff with Iran and all this, sending the aircraft carrier and the bomber task force over the Persian Gulf, I would have thought that these Houthi attacks would have been used as an immediate pretext for, blaming it on Iran. But they kind of haven't done that. And so that to me suggests that the Houthis might actually be behind these. That if there was some kind of false flag or something going on here, that they wouldn't let the Houthis take credit. They would have immediately blamed it on Iran. But I don't know. That's me speculating there. But yes, it does seem that the Houthis have sort of launched a drone program that's sort of now running in earnest.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things here is that most of the people I see covering it do this thing where they go, there's all these tensions with Iran, and then suddenly the Houthis are carrying out all these attacks on Saudi Arabia. It must be because of Iran. But at the same time, fighting broke out again in Hodeidah. And this is a big deal for the Houthis, who I guess made a deal with the UN to take a unilateral step to turn the ports in Hodeidah over to the Yemeni Coast Guard, which may more or less be a force loyal to the Houthi from what I understand. But at the same time, you have this step taken by the Houthis, and I'm sure it came with agreements that the UN was trying to get more aid into the ports and stuff like that. But what you had is fighting break out there, and now we're seeing reports from the World Food Program, which is the UN organization that provides food, that they're thinking about cutting off aid to Houthi areas of Yemen.
Yeah.
And, go ahead, Will.
I was just going to say, I have seen similar reports. I don't know if it was from the WPF, particularly the UN's World Food Program, but I've seen aid groups sort of making similar statements to the Houthis before, sort of saying if you don't stop being bad, then we're going to, withhold our aid. And I don't know, I understand the frustrations of an aid organization who's trying to get, food and medicine and stuff into the hands of civilians. And you're working with a militant group in a war-torn country who might not be the most trustworthy or honest broker. Supplies go missing, food goes missing, things like that. But I would assume that the UN is used to this kind of thing. And this is sort of what they expect when they're operating in a conflict zone. And it sort of strikes me as I don't know if this is the right word, but immature or something to threaten to withhold food aid. It just seems sort of petty, I guess, to suggest that, hey, if you don't, do what we say, we're going to, make your people starve. I don't know. That's sort of, I can't resist having that reaction to this.
Right. Well, it seems like a sanctions move. How well does that ever work?
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah. So anyways, with the fact that the media never covers what's actually going on in Yemen means that it sounds like out of nowhere, this Iran-backed group in Yemen is carrying out these strikes against Saudi Arabia. But in reality, Saudi Arabia is waging a war of genocide on the Yemeni people, and now they're threatening to cut off the food aid. And so the Houthis are lashing out and carrying out strikes. I mean, I guess if you are the Houthis, you say what could be done at this point other than either accepting complete surrender or start launching strikes against Saudi territories and Saudi homes, because that's what happens in Yemen every day. You know, when you listen to Nasser Arabi, and even if, you know, you think he's biased because he lived in Sana'a and has been, you know, probably the victim of being at least startled to death by the Saudis all the time carrying out strikes in his city. You know, he talks about these airstrikes are going on every day. They're blowing up houses and homes and hospitals and roads and, you know, just water treatment facilities in Yemen. So it's no wonder why, you know, they would want to wage that same kind of war back at Saudi Arabia. It's just incredible that the side that's the most powerful and backed by the biggest and, you know, strongest empire in world history gets to pretend like when they do it, it's just bringing justice. And when the other side does it, it's after terrorism. And then, you know, you get to blame Iran and, you know, potentially carry out strikes there. Now, as Will said, I think luckily, other than the first drone bombings and then whoever carried out the bombings in that port, most of this hasn't been blamed on Iran. And that for now is good news, I guess, Will. I will say that there was an interesting interview on our good friend Joanne Leone's podcast Around the Empire with Elijah Magnier, where he said that he believes Iran is backing these attacks in an unofficial capacity. So who knows? It certainly wouldn't be unlike the Middle East to have all these countries waging asymmetric warfare against each other with proxy forces, but at the same time, I really don't see any evidence of it yet. Will, I think we could probably end today's show on, I guess, a little bit of a good note with this article we have here. I believe I read at Reuters that first a French port and then an Italian port refused to load either weapons or generators onto a ship, a Saudi ship, because of the war in Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, I saw these stories too. I think even, I don't know if in Spain, I don't know if they actually prevented anything from being loaded, but I think there were similar like protests from the dock workers in Spain too, like protesting these Saudi ships being docked at their ports, you know, who are involved in this horrible war effort that's, you know, basically facilitating a genocide, as we've, you know, called the war in Yemen on the show before. I mean, yeah, I think it's a heartening thing. We were sort of talking off air that we wish we'd see more of this happening. And, you know, I'd call on more of our left, you know, our friends on the left who might have some kind of connections with some kind of trade union or anything, any kind of trade union movement. Like, this really needs to be something that they push on harder, because it, you know, there's so few places where we can exert pressure. You know, Congress is barely one. You know, we can't exert any pressure there. We can call our congressmen, but even that doesn't do that much. But in terms of these trade unions simply refusing to load things onto a ship at a dock, I mean, that's a direct way, a form of direct action where you could, combat these wars and push back against them. And so I think that's an extremely heartening and encouraging thing to see.
Right. Normally, you know, when we have sanctions, we end up talking about, you know, blocking food, or in the case of Venezuela, you know, parts for their generators and stuff like that. Where in this case, you have the people being able to decide, no, we're not loading weapons. No, we're not loading these generators that could be used in war. We could allow, you know, civilian stuff into the country. So, you know, it does seem like a great opportunity to do something here. You wonder, Will, how many days of dock workers refusing to, you know, pump Saudi oil off of their ships would, you know, generate some kind of response here. I bet it would be pretty quick.
Yeah, I wonder if they'd fly any sorties on the French ports or something. The Saudis.
All right, Will. Well, it's been great having you on the show again. I think we covered a lot today. And of course, just, you know, people be aware of trying to do something against Iran, because Bolton and Pompeo, nut jobs is the way I phrase it. You know, I really think that they're delusional enough to think that this war would somehow go well and end up benefiting us. And it absolutely wouldn't. So, Will, tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, sure. I always appreciate you having me on the show. Your listeners can find me over at RT. I'm a staff writer there, so I don't usually get a byline. I'm sort of just working with like the web team to produce the news for the website. But I do post all of my art, like all the stuff that I work on my Twitter feed, which is you can find at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. I also have author archives that are a bit smaller at antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, and a slightly more sizable one in a place called the Daily Sheeple. So that's where you can find all my writing.
All right, and you can find Foreign Policy Focus at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. Subscribe to the show, give me ratings and reviews, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever you got out there. I've noticed some new rating and reviews recently, and it's always exciting to see that. And if you want to donate, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.